Why did she stop walking the moment his hand touched her shoulder? The shove wasn't violent. It didn't knock her down. It didn't draw blood. But it landed with intention. And intention she had learned to read long before today. Kira Vaughn didn't react the way people expected. She didn't shout, didn't flinch backward, didn't even turn around right away. She simply stopped. The gravel path behind the community field felt suddenly narrower, as if the air itself had tightened. Children's laughter drifted faintly from somewhere beyond the lockers, distorted by distance and distraction. Music crackled through cheap speakers. Somewhere, a generator coughed. But right here, everything slowed. Her body absorbed the shove the way it had absorbed recoil, blast pressure, bad landings. Years of training had taught her how to stay upright without looking defensive, how to remain calm without looking weak. Rook felt it instantly. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He just went still. The kind of stillness that doesn't belong to pets. People thought danger was loud. They were wrong. Kira kept her eyes forward, jaw relaxed, shoulders square. She could feel Rook at her side, not touching her, not crowding, just aligned, perfectly placed. His weight had shifted. His breathing had changed. She knew that rhythm better than her own pulse. Behind her, one of the young men laughed. It wasn't nervous yet, still careless, still entitled. "Relax," someone said. It was nothing. Nothing. That word echoed louder than the shove itself. Kira had heard it before, in different accents, different countries, different rooms where the lights flickered and everyone pretended not to notice what mattered. Nothing was ever nothing. She exhaled slowly through her nose and lifted her hand just enough for Rook to see it. "Stay," she said softly. He didn't blink. The men didn't know what they were looking at. To them, Rook was just a dog in a vest. To them, she was just a woman in a hoodie, out of place, inconvenient, ignorable. That was the mistake. Because what they couldn't see was the invisible line that had already been crossed, and the discipline holding everything back. Kira had spent most of her adult life learning when not to act. It was harder than learning how. She had learned it in briefing rooms where her voice was the quietest, on missions where hesitation meant survival, in moments where her instincts screamed and her orders demanded patience. Restraint wasn't weakness. It was control. And control was the hardest skill she had ever earned. The camera lens hovered nearby now, not directly in her face, just close enough to remind her that whatever happened next would be remembered wrong. She hated that part the most. Rook's ears tracked movement behind them, calculating angles, measuring intent. His body remained perfectly neutral, but Kira could feel the tension humming through him like a live wire beneath skin. He was waiting. Not for permission. For judgment. Because once, long ago, she had taught him that commands weren't everything. That context mattered. That thinking mattered. That lesson had saved her life. And now, standing on a forgotten gravel path behind a children's fair, it hovered again, heavy, unresolved. A voice cut through the silence, sarcastic, too close. "You gonna say something, or just let your dog stare us down?" Kira turned slowly. Her eyes met his. There was no anger in them, no threat, just clarity. "Step back," she said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. He smiled. People smiled when they thought they were winning. That smile tightened something deep in her chest, not fear, not rage. Recognition. She had seen that smile before, on men who mistook access for entitlement, on men who believed restraint was permission. He reached out again. This time closer. Too close. The world narrowed to inches and breath and muscle memory. Rook moved. Not wildly. Not emotionally. Precisely. The impact wasn't dramatic. There was no snapping bark, no chaos. Just the sudden, terrifying efficiency of a body doing exactly what it had been trained to do: intercept, control, neutralize. The man hit the ground hard, shock louder than pain. Gasps rippled outward. Kira's hand was already raised. Out. Rook released instantly. No hesitation, no confusion. He returned to her side and stood guard, silent and immovable. For a moment, no one spoke. They stared at the dog, at the woman, at the distance between what they assumed and what they had just witnessed. Someone whispered, "That wasn't aggression." They were right. It was discipline. And discipline always looks terrifying to those who have never practiced it. The police arrived quietly. No sirens, no drama, just procedure. Kira answered questions calmly. Honestly, she didn't embellish, she didn't apologize. When asked if she wanted to press charges, she looked at the man still sitting on the gravel, stunned and pale. No, she said. Not because she couldn't, but because she didn't need to. Some lessons don't require punishment to land. As the crowd thinned and the noise returned to normal, Kira knelt in the grass and checked Rook's paws, his legs, his breathing. He leaned his forehead briefly against hers, a grounding touch they had learned in places far from here. "You did good," she whispered. He wagged once. Later, when her niece asked if she had been scared, Kira paused. "Yes," she said finally, "a little. But not of them." She didn't explain further. Some truths weren't meant to be simplified. That night alone in her quiet house, Kira replayed the moment again and again. Not the shove, not the fall. The restraint. The choice not to escalate. The invisible line between protection and violence. She wondered, briefly, if she had truly left the war behind, or if it had simply followed her home, waiting for the moment she would be needed again. Sometimes dignity doesn't announce itself. It waits. Why did the phone keep ringing when she already knew who it would be? Kira stared at the screen until it went dark again. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the steady rhythm of Rook's breathing from the corner. He slept lightly now, but even in rest his ears twitched at distant sounds, cars passing, a door closing somewhere down the street. Some habits never left. Neither did some questions. She hadn't planned on the incident becoming anything more than a moment, a correction, a reminder. She had walked away believing that restraint had done its job. But restraint, she was learning, had a way of echoing. The call came again. This time she answered. Her sister's voice was controlled, but Kira could hear the worry pressed flat beneath it. The principal called, said there was police activity at the field, said your name. Kira closed her eyes. It's handled. That's not comforting. It's honest. There was a pause, a long one. Kira pictured her sister standing in the living room, arms crossed, trying to decide whether to be angry or relieved. She'd always been better at that kind of calculation than Kira ever was. Annie saw something, her sister finally said. She's asking questions. Kira leaned back against the counter and looked at Rook. His eyes were open now, watching her, always watching her. What kind of questions? She asked. The silence on the other end stretched. The kind I don't know how to answer. About you, about him. Kira swallowed. She had spent years learning how to explain danger in briefings, how to compress fear into bullet points and probability charts. Explaining it to a child felt harder. I'll talk to her, Kira said. You shouldn't have to, her sister replied softly. Not at a school event, not ever. Kira didn't argue. She didn't have the energy to pretend the world worked the way it was supposed to. After they hung up, she stayed where she was, hands resting on the counter, listening to the house breathe around her. She hadn't realized how tense she was until Rook stood and walked over, placing his head against her thigh. Not affection. Grounding. "I know," she murmured. "I know." Sleep didn't come easily that night. When it did, it brought memories she hadn't invited. Dust, heat, the taste of metal at the back of her throat. Afghanistan had never waited for permission to return. It arrived in fragments, sounds, smells, the angle of a shadow that didn't belong. She saw Rook again as he had been then, younger, leaner, his movements sharp as cut glass. She felt the weight of her rifle, the pressure of night vision goggles against her face. She remembered the moment he had stopped in the doorway of that compound and refused to move. She had trusted him without understanding why. That trust had saved her life. The memory lingered into morning, clinging to her like smoke. She ran Rook through obedience drills in the backyard, not because he needed it, but because she did. The repetition steadied her. Sit, down, stay, come, each command a small promise kept. 3 days later, the call she had been bracing for finally came. The voice on the other end was professional, measured, too calm to be good news. They had reviewed the footage, they had spoken to witnesses, they had questions. She answered them all without defensiveness, without pride, just facts, just truth. At the end of the call, there was a pause. "That dog showed exceptional restraint," the woman said. "So did you." Kira thanked her and hung up, unsure whether the words were meant as praise or warning. That uncertainty followed her through the week. At the grocery store, at the gas station, on quiet walks with Rook through the neighborhood. People noticed the vest now, not with fear, with curiosity, with something like recalibration. She didn't correct them, she never did. On Saturday morning, her niece arrived with a backpack and a seriousness that felt older than 9. Annie approached Rook carefully, waiting for permission with a patience that made something ache in Kira's chest. "Is he working?" the girl asked. "Not right now," Kira said, "but he still needs respect." Annie nodded solemnly and knelt to pet him the way she had been taught. Rook accepted the contact without shifting his attention from Kira. He always checked in first. Later, while pancakes burned slightly on the stove, Annie asked the question Kira had been dreading. "Were you scared?" she asked. Kira didn't answer right away. She watched steam rise from the pan, watched Rook lie at her feet. "Yes," she said finally, "but not the way you think." "Of what?" "Of him having to do more than he needed to." Annie considered that, but he didn't. "No," Kira said, "because he knew better." "Because you taught him." Kira smiled faintly. "Because we taught each other." That night, after her niece had fallen asleep on the couch with Rook curled protectively nearby, Kira sat alone with her thoughts. The incident at the field had cracked something open. Not fear, but purpose. She had spent months telling herself she was done. That retirement meant distance, that she could be quiet now. But quiet didn't mean finished. The call came the following Tuesday. This one was different, not local, not concerned. Interested. They had seen the footage, not just of the incident, but of everything that followed. The restraint, the release, the way Rook had returned to guard without instruction. They wanted to talk about possibilities. Kira listened without interrupting, without hope. Hope was dangerous. When the offer came, she didn't accept it right away. That night she sat on the floor beside Rook, her back against the couch, his head resting on her knee. She thought about the handler whose ribs had been broken weeks later, about the dog that hadn't been as lucky as Rook, about the thin line between control and chaos, and how easily it was misunderstood. She thought about all the dogs like him, warriors who came home and were expected to forget who they were. "Would you do it again?" she asked him quietly, "if I asked you to?" Rook lifted his head and met her eyes. He didn't need to answer. The evaluation was scheduled 10 days later. She prepared the way she always had, not with confidence but with diligence. She reviewed records, designed demonstrations, anticipated skepticism. On the morning of the assessment, she stood outside the building with Rook at her side and felt something unfamiliar tighten in her chest. This wasn't a mission. There were no enemies, no extraction points. This was judgment. Inside, the room was bright and clinical. 5 civilians sat behind a table, their expressions polite but guarded. One military officer sat apart, silent. They asked about training, about aggression, about risk. Kira answered carefully, not defensively, not emotionally. When asked if Rook could distinguish between threat and nuisance, she stood and unclipped his lead. "Watch," she said. She demonstrated obedience first, then patience, then restraint. They brought in distractions, noise, sudden movement. Rook processed it all without breaking posture. Finally, they tested stress. A man approached her aggressively, shouted, shoved her shoulder. Kira felt her heart hammer, but she didn't command Rook. She trusted him. He stepped into position, warning stance, no engagement. Only when the man raised his hand again did Rook shift forward, controlled, measured, ready. "Out," she said quietly. He obeyed instantly. The room was silent. One of the board members removed her glasses, hands trembling slightly. "That," she said, "is not an attack dog." "No," Kira replied, "that's a partner." When the decision came, it wasn't triumphant, it was sober, earned. As they left the building, Rook's tail wagged once, just once. Outside, the sky was clear, ordinary, the world moved on. Kira knelt and pressed her forehead to his. "We're not done," she whispered. "Not with violence. Not with war. But with something quieter, harder. Teaching the world the difference between danger and dignity." And somewhere deep inside, she felt the war loosen its grip, not because it had been forgotten, but because it had finally been understood. Sometimes strength doesn't shout. Sometimes it waits until someone is ready to listen. Why did the silence after success feel heavier than failure ever had? Kira noticed it on the drive home. Not relief. Not pride. Weight. The kind that settled into your chest when something important had shifted, and you didn't yet know what it would cost. Rook lay in the back of the vehicle, chin resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. Even now, after the evaluation, after the calm voices and nodding heads and signatures on paper, he hadn't truly relaxed. Neither had she. Passing hadn't erased the question. It had amplified it. Because proving restraint once was easy, living it every day was harder. The instructor position started quietly. No ceremony, no applause, just an ID badge, a schedule, and a kennel that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old concrete. Kira liked that. Purpose didn't need fanfare, it needed consistency. The first morning, 8 handlers stood in a loose line on the training field. 7 men, 1 woman, different ages, different branches, same uncertainty hiding behind posture. They all looked at Rook the same way people always did, curious, cautious, slightly awed. They expected demonstrations of power. Kira gave them silence. She didn't introduce herself with her record. She didn't talk about deployments or medals or numbers. She stood beside Rook, hands relaxed at her sides, and let the dog sit calmly while the wind moved through the grass. "Before we start," she said, voice even, "you need to understand something. If you're here to learn how to control a dog, you're already behind." A few brows furrowed. Someone shifted his weight. "You're here to learn how to control yourself." That landed harder. Over the weeks, she watched patterns emerge. Overconfidence, hesitation, fear disguised as authority. Some handlers barked commands like noise could replace trust. Others hesitated so much their dogs made decisions for them. Kira corrected quietly, repeated drills, made them slow down. Rook demonstrated when words failed. He showed them what discipline looked like, not rigid but responsive, how a slight shift of weight mattered, how patience could diffuse tension faster than force. Some nights after long days, Kira went home exhausted in a way she hadn't felt in years. Not the adrenaline crash of missions, but something deeper, emotional labor, responsibility. She wasn't just training dogs. She was shaping futures. The call came in late November, on a day that smelled like rain. Kira was midway through a detection drill when her phone vibrated in her pocket. She ignored it until Rook completed his sequence flawlessly. Only then did she step aside. The voice on the line was careful, professional. They had arrested the man. Not for her incident, for another. This time a service dog had been injured, the handler too. The words hit like cold water. Kira felt anger rise sharp, immediate, but she held it down. Anger didn't help. Understanding did. They want to establish a pattern, the officer explained. Your testimony could matter. Kira looked across the field at Rook. He sat in the shade watching her, waiting. Yes, she said, I'll testify. The night before the hearing, she barely slept. Not from fear of facing the man. From fear of memory. Courtrooms were quiet in a way that felt unnatural to her. No cover, no exits marked in her mind, just wood and light and expectation. She told the truth without drama, without embellishment. She described restraint. The defense tried to turn discipline into danger, tried to make Rook a weapon instead of a partner, tried to make her background something threatening. Kira didn't argue. She explained. There was a difference. When she stepped down from the stand, she felt emptied out, not victorious, just done. Outside the courthouse, the sky had opened into pale winter sunlight. She breathed deeply, as if she'd been holding air for months. Rook met her at home like he always did, present, grounding, unchanged. That constancy mattered more than she'd ever admitted. Weeks passed, then months. The program expanded. Her name began circulating in rooms she never saw. Standards were drafted, policies debated. Some people pushed back hard. Zero tolerance, no exceptions. Kira listened. Then she spoke. She talked about nuance, about context, about how restraint wasn't the absence of force, it was mastery over it. She talked about the cost of misunderstanding, about dogs retired too early, about handlers stripped of purpose, about lives quietly diminished because fear made decisions faster than reason. Not everyone agreed. Enough did. The call from Washington came on a Tuesday. They wanted her to lead the pilot program. She didn't answer right away. That night she sat on the porch with Rook, the air cool and still. She thought about the field in Riverton, about the shove, about how small moments could ripple outward in ways you never anticipated. Are we ready for this? She asked him quietly. Rook leaned against her leg. He always had been. The opening of the Riverton Training Center was understated. A sign, a gate, a field ready to be used. On the first day, Kira stood watching handlers arrive with their dogs, some eager, some wary, all carrying history. She felt something loosen in her chest. This wasn't redemption. It was continuation. She began every class the same way. Your dog will never be perfect, she told them. Neither will you. The goal isn't perfection, it's trust. She watched transformations happen slowly. A nervous dog relax, a rigid handler soften, a partnership form not through dominance but through respect. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Kira noticed Annie standing near the fence with her sister, watching quietly. Rook spotted her instantly, tail wagging once before settling again. Annie waved. Kira waved back. Later, when Annie asked if she could work with dogs someday, Kira didn't hesitate. If you want to, she said, But only if you remember this. Remember what? That strength isn't about how hard you can act. It's about how much you can hold back. Annie nodded seriously, like she was storing the words somewhere important. That night, after everyone had gone home, Kira walked the empty field with Rook at her side. The wind moved through the grass the way it always had. She thought about the war, about how it never really ended, it just changed shape. She wasn't fighting anymore. She was teaching, protecting, preventing. Sometimes dignity didn't speak. It trained. Why did the call come at dawn, when nothing good ever waited there? Kira answered before the second ring. She didn't need to see the number. Dawn calls carried a certain gravity, quiet, deliberate, unavoidable. Rook was already awake. He always was. His head lifted from the floor the moment her breathing changed, eyes sharp despite the dim light. Whatever this was, he felt it too. There had been an incident. Not local. Not small. The words were careful, but the meaning wasn't. A handler overseas, a dog with a record like Rook's, a crowd, confusion, video already circulating without context. They wanted her assessment, not later, now. Kira sat on the edge of the bed, phone pressed to her ear, and listened without interrupting. She had learned long ago that the most important details came after the first explanation, when people stopped trying to control the narrative and started revealing the truth. When the call ended, the room felt colder. She looked at Rook. He rose and came to her side, resting his chin against her knee. "I know," she whispered. The flight was quiet. No entourage, no announcements, just Kira, a seat by the window, and a weight in her chest that grew heavier with every mile. She reviewed the footage on a secure tablet, again and again. The dog had acted. The handler had hesitated. The crowd had panicked. No one had been killed, but someone had been hurt, and the internet had already decided who to blame. By the time she landed, the story had hardened into something ugly and simple: a dangerous dog, an unstable handler, a failure of training. Simple stories were easy. True ones were not. The base was smaller than she expected. Temporary structures, dust in the air, faces lined with fatigue rather than fear. She met the handler in a quiet room near the kennels. He was younger than she thought, not inexperienced, just worn. The kind of exhaustion that came from caring deeply and feeling like you failed anyway. He didn't defend himself. That told her more than any explanation could. "I froze," he said finally, staring at his hands, "for half a second, and in that half second everything went wrong." Kira nodded. "Half a second is a lifetime," she said gently. She spent hours with the dog, observing, testing, letting him set the pace. He was not aggressive, he was confused. Confusion was dangerous, but it was fixable. "This isn't a bad dog," she told the command staff later. "This is a broken communication loop." They wanted certainty, guarantees, liability assessments. Kira gave them reality. "There are no guarantees," she said. "Only preparation and trust requires time." They didn't like that answer. The pressure came fast, from above, from outside, from voices that had never stood between a crowd and a decision that couldn't be undone. Shut the program down, suspend the handler, retire the dog. Kira felt the familiar pull of anger, but she steadied herself. "This is exactly why the Riverton model exists," she said. "If you dismantle it every time fear shows up, you teach people to act out of fear." Silence followed. Then resistance. Then negotiation. Days blurred together. Meetings, assessments, demonstrations under scrutiny, every move watched, every choice dissected. Rook remained at her side through it all, calm, unimpressed by authority, grounded. Late one evening, alone in the kennel corridor, Kira finally let herself feel the doubt she'd been holding back. What if this was too big? What if she was wrong? She rested her forehead against the cool metal of the kennel door and breathed. Rook stepped closer, pressed against her leg, present, certain. Not blind loyalty. Confidence. That steadied her. The decision came without celebration. The program would continue under new guidelines: mandatory recalibration training, handler psychological screening, longer pairing periods. It wasn't perfect. It was progress. The handler was reinstated on probation. The dog reassigned to retraining rather than retirement. When Kira told them, the handler's shoulders sagged with relief. He didn't smile. He just nodded like someone who had been holding his breath for too long. "Thank you," he said quietly. Kira shook her head. "You earned it by telling the truth." On the flight home, she stared out the window as the landscape shifted beneath them. She thought about how easily narratives formed and how rarely they were questioned. Back in Riverton, winter had settled in. The field was quiet. Frost traced the edges of the grass. Training resumed. But something had changed. The instructors watched her more closely now. So did the administrators. Her words carried more weight, but also more scrutiny. Leadership always did. One afternoon, Annie visited again. She stood watching a training session, hands stuffed into her coat pockets. "Why do people get scared of dogs like him?" she asked. Kira considered the question. "Because they don't understand what restraint looks like," she said. "They think power always wants to escape." Annie frowned, "But it doesn't." "No," Kira said softly, "it waits." That evening, alone with Rook, Kira sat on the floor and leaned against the couch, the way she always did when she needed grounding. The house was quiet, safe. She thought about the handler overseas, about the dog finding his footing again, about how close everything had come to collapse. She realized something then, not with fear but with clarity. This wasn't about dogs. It never had been. It was about teaching humans to trust discipline over instinct, to pause instead of panic, to see dignity in restraint. Sometimes dignity didn't roar. It held the line and waited for the world to catch up. Why did the victory feel incomplete when the room finally went quiet? Kira noticed it the moment the meeting ended. Chairs scraped back, voices softened, decisions made. Yet the weight in her chest didn't lift. It settled deeper, like something unfinished had taken root. Rook sensed it before she did. He stayed closer than usual that evening, shadowing her movements through the house, his presence steady but insistent. Not alarm, awareness. She had learned to trust that distinction. The weeks after the overseas incident brought attention she hadn't asked for. Articles, panels, carefully worded praise that always seemed to circle the same idea: control, risk management, liability. Rarely did anyone talk about trust. She declined most interviews, not out of fear but because stories changed once they left her mouth. They flattened, simplified, lost the quiet parts that mattered most. One request she didn't refuse came from a small veterans center just outside Riverton. No cameras, no press, just a room of people who had served and come home carrying things that didn't fit neatly into resumes. Kira stood at the front with Rook at her side and felt something unfamiliar flutter in her chest. Vulnerability. She spoke without slides, without prepared remarks. She talked about hesitation, about the cost of certainty, about dogs who waited for guidance that never came, and handlers who never forgave themselves. She talked about the night she'd frozen once, years ago, about the man who had stepped into her line of fire and how close she'd come to making a mistake she couldn't undo. The room was silent. Afterward, a woman approached her, former medic, hands still shaky. "I thought restraint meant I was weak," the woman said. "I thought if I'd acted faster, louder, maybe things would have been different." Kira met her eyes. Sometimes acting slower is what saves you, she said. The words stayed with her long after the meeting ended. That night she dreamed of Rook running ahead of her in a place with no edges, no commands, just open ground. When she woke, her heart was racing, not from fear but from loss. Rook was older now, not in years, still strong, still sharp, but in weight carried. She saw it in the way he rested longer after training, in the carefulness of his movements when he thought she wasn't watching. Mortality crept in quietly. She didn't mention it to anyone. The Riverton Center continued to grow. More handlers, more dogs, more stories arriving half-formed and heavy. Kiera absorbed them all, careful not to let them crush her. But something else was building too. Pressure. A proposal circulated through higher command, automated response systems, AI-assisted threat detection, reduced reliance on handler judgment. Efficiency. Kiera read the draft twice, then a third time. It promised safety, consistency, reduced human error. It also removed the pause. She spoke against it in the review meeting, calm, precise, firm. Judgment can't be automated, she said. Neither can dignity. Some nodded, others didn't. After the meeting, the officer who had once sat silently during her evaluation approached her. "You're making powerful enemies," he said quietly. "Not a threat, a warning." Kiera smiled faintly. "Then they're paying attention." That evening she stayed late at the center, running Rook through gentle exercises. Not drills, conversations. She watched him move, remembered the first time she'd met him, how he'd assessed her before accepting her, how trust had been a choice, not a command. She knelt beside him and rested her forehead against his. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "we did this right." Rook exhaled slowly, leaning into her. The incident that followed came without warning. A training demonstration, visiting officials, a crowded observation area. A sudden noise, a dropped piece of equipment, a startled dog lunging not at a person but away. Chaos rippled. Kiera reacted without thinking, stepped between handler and dog, used her body to absorb the moment. Her voice cut through the noise, not loud but certain. "Easy breathe." The dog stilled. Later in the quiet aftermath, her knee throbbed where she'd twisted wrong. Nothing serious, but the message was clear. Time was moving. That night she sat alone in the empty field, Rook at her side, stars faint above the lights of the facility. She thought about stepping back, about letting someone else carry this forward, about the cost of staying. She also thought about the handler overseas, about Annie watching from the fence, about the dogs who would never know restraint if no one taught it. The choice wasn't heroic. It was honest. She submitted her recommendation the next morning against automation, for extended mentorship, for human judgment protected, not replaced. She didn't know if it would hold, but she knew she'd said what mattered. In the afternoon, she took Rook on a long walk beyond the training grounds. No vest, no commands, just movement. At a quiet overlook, she stopped and looked out over the town. Ordinary, unremarkable, worth protecting. "Soon," she murmured, not sure what she meant. Rook sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder. Sometimes dignity didn't win loudly. Sometimes it endured. And sometimes the hardest strength of all was knowing when to hold on and when to let go. Why did the hardest decision arrive on the most ordinary morning? There was no warning, no dramatic sign, just sunlight slipping through the kitchen window and the quiet realization that Rook didn't rise as quickly as he used to. He still stood, still watched, still followed her from room to room with the same devotion that had carried them through fire and doubt and restraint. But something in the timing had changed, a half-beat slower, a breath longer before motion. Kiera noticed, because she had trained herself to notice everything. She knelt beside him and ran her hands along his shoulders, his spine, his legs. He leaned into her touch, steady and warm and present, alive. For now, the day unfolded like any other. Emails, calls, schedules, decisions that carried weight for people she might never meet. She moved through them with the same quiet competence she always had. But beneath it all, something was loosening. That afternoon, she canceled her meetings and drove out beyond Riverton, past the training fields, past the places where her voice carried authority. She parked near the open land where the grass bent with the wind and the horizon didn't demand anything from her. She unclipped Rook's leash. He looked at her first. Always permission. She nodded. He ran not fast, not far, but free, nose to the ground, tail moving gently. Content. Kira sat on the hood of the car and watched him, the ache in her chest equal parts gratitude and grief. She thought about all the moments they'd stood together in silence, all the choices made without applause, all the restraint that had kept others safe even when no one noticed. She thought about how easy it would have been at the field that day to let anger decide, to let instinct escalate, to let the world confirm its worst assumptions. She hadn't, because dignity had mattered more. Rook returned and sat at her feet, looking up at her as if waiting for the next task. "There isn't one," she said softly, "not today." The veterinarian was gentle, honest, respectful. Kira appreciated that more than reassurance. There was time, not endless, but enough to do this right. She thanked him and drove home in silence, Rook's head resting against the seat, his breathing steady. The house welcomed them like it always had. That evening, Annie came over with her sister. They brought dinner and laughter and the easy noise of people who loved her without conditions. Annie sprawled on the floor with Rook, telling him about school, about a dog in her class she wanted to train someday. "He listens," Annie said proudly. Kira smiled. "He always has." Later, after they left and the house grew quiet again, Kira sat on the floor beside Rook, her back against the couch, his body pressed lightly against her leg. The familiar posture, the one that had grounded her through so much. "I won't ask you for more," she whispered. "You've already given everything." Rook sighed and rested his head on her knee. The announcement came a week later. Not dramatic, not final. She would step down from daily operations, transition into an advisory role, mentor instructors, shape policy quietly from the edges. Some people protested, others understood immediately. Leadership, she had learned, wasn't about presence. It was about continuity. On her last official day at the Riverton Center, she walked the field alone at dawn. Frost clung to the grass. The air was sharp and clean. She stopped where it had all begun, the place where she'd first stood and said nothing, letting silence teach what words could not. Rook sat beside her. She clipped the leash onto his vest for the last time. Not because he needed it, because she did. The ceremony was small, intentional, no speeches, just acknowledgments, handshakes, a plaque she didn't ask for. When it was over, Kira didn't linger. She walked away with Rook at her side, the gate closing quietly behind them. Life slowed. Days became measured in small rituals, morning walks, sunlit naps, gentle training sessions that felt more like conversation than command. Kira found herself sleeping better, breathing deeper. She still advised, still spoke when it mattered, still fought in her own way against systems that mistook efficiency for wisdom. But she no longer carried it all. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the world softened into gold, Rook struggled briefly to rise. Kira was beside him instantly, hands steady, voice calm. "It's okay," she murmured. "Take your time." He did. They stayed there for a long while afterward, just breathing together. No fear, no urgency. When the end came, it was quiet. As it should be. Kira held him as his breathing slowed, her tears falling not from panic, but from gratitude. from the knowledge that nothing essential had been left undone. She buried him beneath the old oak behind the house, where the wind moved gently through the branches and the ground felt solid and kind. Annie helped Sirius careful. He was brave, Annie said. Yes, Kira replied, but more than that, he was kind. Time passed. The world continued to argue loudly about power and fear and control. Kira continued to teach, quietly, those willing to listen. Sometimes when she walked alone at dusk, she still felt Rook beside her, not as a ghost, as a lesson. She remembered the shove, the restraint, the moment everything could have gone wrong and didn't. She understood now what that moment had truly been. Not an act of defense. An act of dignity. Because strength isn't proven by how quickly you strike. It's proven by how carefully you choose not to. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't shout or demand to be seen. Sometimes it simply acts. And then it stays.